Thank you, Raghu, for inviting me here. I know we are running way behind time, so I will just say a few remarks and then see if there is an interest in the audience to have a deeper discussion. I'm an economist by training. So, my perspective will be somewhat macro and aggregate relative to what you are, because I saw some very fascinating discussions about nuts and bolts of technologies and what to solve, what not to solve. The task I've been given is to talk about the bigger picture and what is going on. The world first time came together to talk about global goals because there was a concern that countries were making progress at a very uneven level. And there wasn't enough, given all of the hurly-burly of local politics at the national level, there wasn't enough pressure on the governments to do as much as they could. So the first round was called the Millennium Development Goals. And these were narrower goals around maternal mortality, child mortality, and set an initial agenda to try and drive countries towards progress. India, unfortunately, missed achieving those goals in 2015. But many other countries actually made substantive progress. And as you know, in any audience, even here, building consensus on what to do, what not to do, is always a challenge. Goals of this type focus the mind. They give you a certain set of targets to pursue and have been helpful to move forward in. So with renewed enthusiasm, now the world has committed to something called the Sustainable Development Goals. And in particular, in health, there is goal number 3, SDG 3, that is a health goal. And if you at all have time, and you may not, but if you do, I would invite you to take a look at the sub-targets, 3.1 to 3.9, on these goals. They are ambitious targets. They try to push countries to go further than they have done so far on the old goals, maternal mortality, child mortality, and such like, but also set up a new goals. And one of them, 3.7, is universal healthcare, is to try and see if countries can now commit towards a journey of universal healthcare. Right? And it's not an easy conversation to have. Just to give you a set of numbers to carry around in your head, India spends somewhere near 4% of GDP on healthcare, not the government, the aggregate amount of expenditure. Depending on how you calculate it, it comes to about 8 or 9 lakh crores is the total expenditure on healthcare. The Indian governments, and really it is mostly the state governments that have the decision-making power here, not the central government. The central government, by design, is a small player in healthcare, are expected to come up with this money. The reality, unfortunately, is that since 1947 to today, no state government has come up with the amount of money needed. Roughly speaking, we are stuck at 1% of GDP for healthcare as our allocation. In that time period, Thailand, China, Rwanda, many countries, poorer and richer than ours, have quadrupled the amount of money that the government is spending. That has not happened in India, and at least so far, there is no indication that for the next 2 decades, you're going to see any such movement on the part of the government. So essentially what you're left with is a market in which private people are paying, private people are providing healthcare. And of course, government is an important player. 1% of GDP is not nothing in a $125 billion market that comes to about maybe $25, $30 billion. That's a reasonable sum of money. And they are focused on a very important set of goals, which is to try and deliver maternal and child health to children, to deal with infectious disease. One embarrassing fact about India is that tuberculosis, a disease that much of the world has now vanquished, is still with us. We are losing about 3 million lives a year. China, in 4 years, starting roughly where we were, to a global standard, they were able to move. We are not anywhere close to that. But the good thing is that the administration has taken note of this issue in a very serious way. And given what I know about it from my a job that I just held a few months ago with the Gates Foundation, I believe that the strategies, the ideas on the table are pretty good. And we will be able to make good progress on them. We're also living with ancient diseases that the world has forgotten about, but are still important diseases for us. In Bihar, Eastern UP, slivers of West Bengal, you still have something called Kala Azar. It's a disease, Satyajit Ray died, his dad died of it. It was called Dum Dum fever because it was in the Calcutta area that you saw much of this. There are still 35 million people carrying this disease with them, active disease. There is a lot of effort ongoing to eradicate this disease. It's a disease that was identified by a British Army Major, General Major Leishman. That's why it's known as visceral leishmaniasis after him. But that's actually not the scariest disease that we are dealing with. The scariest disease we're dealing with is lymphatic filariasis. There are over 600 million people at risk for getting this disease. In fact, the belief is that a number of our children, because 600 million people just doesn't include poor people, right? It includes middle class, upper income people. And this is mainly in the south that you see this, have a large load of microfilaria in there. It's a large disease. My belief again is there is a good plan. It requires a lot more pressure on the execution side to actually deal with this issue. But I think we will be able to get rid of it. On the core maternal child health goals, for which the government has enough money, enough resources, I fear the progress is uneven. And depending on who you talk to, there's only about a 50% chance that India will meet our sustainable development goals. And to just give you a sense of that number, what that number is, last year, 27 million children were born in India. About 1 million did not make it past the first year of birth, right? Now, this number used to be 2 million, 20 years ago. So that's a terrific progress from 2 million to 1 million. Given today's understanding of healthcare and particularly around maternal child health, that number should be 50,000 children. So we are losing 9.5 lakh children per year almost needlessly. A lot of media attention is on the 70 deaths in Gorakhpur. The reality is every day, hundreds of children are dying, perhaps needlessly. The sustainable development goal is that 500,000 children will die, Indian children will die by 2030. So not at all an ambitious goal. Yet there's only a 50% chance that we'll actually meet that goal. And something similar is true on the maternal mortality side. Now, my sense, though, is the government is well aware of this. Government is trying very hard to get its architecture in place, to move, to make things happen. And as you know, this is a vast country where things are not as easily done as perhaps in smaller, more compact nations. Just to give you one example, if I look at maternal mortality, it used to be the case, maybe 10 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, that what was needed was simple stuff in primary care. And you could achieve the kind of numbers you wanted. Unfortunately, our very success has now brought us to a point where these simple measures will not help. You will need to provide mothers truly good emergency care. Right? And if I look at C-section rates as a marker of emergency care availability, it's not a good marker, but it's the only one that's for which data is available countrywide, to give you a sense of the constraints that we have. While it is true that in Telangana, overall, C-section rates have crossed 50%. Khammam, you'll be lucky if you had a natural birth. C-section rates are 80%. And it's not just the private sector. Public sector is just 5 or 10% behind the private sector in doing these numbers. Whatever your debate on the right number of 10% or 15% C-section rates, everybody will agree that 80% is excessively high. You got a natural birth, the baby came out in the taxi. That's the only way you would have got a natural birth. Otherwise, you entered the hospital, there would have been a C-section. Compare that with Shravasti in Uttar Pradesh. 0.4% is the C-section rate. And in fact, there is a lovely map of India which shows you availability of surgical care. Northern Karnataka, by the way, falls in the same category as Shravasti, whereas Southern Karnataka falls in the same category as Khammam. Right? It gives you a sense of where the significant gaps now are and what we need to overcome over the next 10 years if we are indeed going to get to the Sustainable Development Goals. Merely putting out basic care will not actually be enough. In the Gates Foundation, we did a very large trial in UP, working with Dr. Atul Gawande of the Checklist Manifesto fame to try and improve quality of delivery. Right? It was a 3-year multi-center. We had over, I don't remember now, but about 2 lakh births in our overall cohort that we tracked. Right? And all of the things that you would imagine that needed to be done were done in that process. There was simply no impact on mortality at all. Not on mortality, but not on morbidity. 1 week later, was the mother better off because as you know, while maternal mortality number in absolute is small, morbidity number is 100 times more. Many, many women leave injured from a facility than leave completely well to have another baby when they are finished with the delivery process. There was no impact at all. In fact, the New England Journal of Medicine, if you read, wrote a scathing editorial about this overall work, arguing that in this day and age, to expect mothers to survive without access to emergency care is simply magical thinking. Right? You need to be able to ensure that you get surgical access. In fact, this year, if you track disease control priorities of developing countries, it's a volume every 10 years that is brought out by the WHO, which talks about what are the priorities that developing countries should be following and does a good analysis of cost effectiveness. They have a full volume now on essential surgery. But if I switch gears and I say, okay, maternal child health, etc., we know the problems, we know the issues, it's not easy to do, but there is work in progress, and I would submit to you there is enough money on the table. It may not be spent well, there may be challenges on how that money should be spent, but the government's expenditure of $20–25 billion is enough. And every year the government is getting better at doing what it's doing. And just so that I make another point on this, not to run the government down entirely on this, out of the 27 million babies that were born last year, somewhere near 60% of those babies were delivered by government employees. Across the length and breadth of the country. And the fact that we have infant and maternal mortality rates that are not, certainly well above the SDGs, but still much, much better than what you might see in an average African country, speaks to, how well the government system has done. But if you move away from that and you ask the question, what about universal health care? What about all of the stuff that we do? Most of the people in this room are not doing maternal child health. You're not delivering babies, you're not doing C-sections, or maybe some of you are doing C-sections, but mostly you're doing something else. That, unfortunately, is an issue on which we are a little bit in a open structure. There is no grand plan in place. And I certainly believe that schemes like Ayushman Bharat have been interesting schemes. But the reality is, in a market that needs $125 billion, that entire scheme is about $1 billion plus minus. Right? And there's no expectation that that scheme will go to even $3 or $4 billion. Forget going to $80 billion. Right? And by which time the actual requirement will go up quite a bit. So they can play a very big catalytic role, and under some very good leadership that they've been able to find, I think they're doing terrific work. But if we are expecting that to solve the issues of primary care or even secondary care, I think that's going to be a big stretch. Even they will admit that that's not their goal, and that's really not what they are, kind of sized to equip, to deliver. Right? The good story, though, is that if I look at the amount of money we are spending as a country, right, per capita, in dollar terms, just so that we can compare it with the rest of the world, right? We are roughly, in aggregate, $300 per capita on a PPP basis per year. Right? Countries like Thailand started their journey on universal health care and have delivered one of the best health systems in the world at $200 per capita. Rwanda spends $130 per capita. Their record of primary care is 98% coverage of primary care. And they, for those of you that are in the health tech segment, would have heard of Babylon. Babylon came out of Rwanda, right? Unfortunately, it did not come out of India, but certainly did not come out of the West, right? It came out of a Rwandese company to try and do something about what is going on in primary care, right? And then, I saw in the previous panel a discussion about is a lot of the health tech work, a lot of the health tech innovation, it is going to be essential. There is no debate about that. The question is a lot that is going on solutions looking for problems? Or are there ways, and I saw Pramod talk about this, I saw Raghu talk about this, NASSCOM is trying to bring some of these conversations together. Are there ways in which one can see what is needed and how it can be delivered to people? Now, of course, there is an issue about who will pay for it, right? Again, there's another interesting positive fact that's coming out for us in India, right? We are used to thinking of India, in the famous words of Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the bhuka nanga pyasa, the garibi hatao. That image of India is forever gone. By 2022, the number of people below $2 a day in India will be under 1%, right? So the absolute dirt poor, I come, a long time ago, I was associated with the financial services industry, right? In Eastern UP, Mirzapur, 15, 20 years ago, you could go with a $500 rupee loan, and there'd be a crowd of women waiting to get that loan. Today, you don't talk about anything less than 15,000 rupees, you will not get anybody showing up for the meeting, right? Because the economy has changed entirely. The ability of people to pay, the ability of people to demand services, and the telecom revolution tells us, if you've traveled Indigo recently, I'm a big admirer of that airline. You see the people sitting around you. I had a lovely passenger next to me once who was a sariwala from Chennai, who had always wanted to visit Jallianwala Bagh. He says, I flew everywhere, right? It was really quite an amazing conversation I had with him as to how a company like Indigo recognizes that to make money in India, you can't simply be doing 15,000 rupee fares, but you have to think about 1,500 rupee fares. And if the government dropped the ATF tax, it'd be just unbelievable, what the volume of business that will be, right? That kind of approach is what will be needed here if we have to deliver. In aggregate, we have enough money. No question about that, right? Now, where are some of the directions in which solutions might lie? One thing is very, very clear. Nobody has made a good healthcare system work. Forget preventive care. That, of course, is very important, but quite challenging. Not so much because it's hard to deliver. It's actually easy to deliver. Uptake is very low, right? If you read disease control priorities of developing countries, you'll see that obesity-related advice given to school children, right, which seems like a very easy solution to deliver, per year of life saved, $1 million is the cost. Why? Because adoption of behavior change messages is very poor, right? We know it in our lives, otherwise you'd have no obese doctors, right? If knowledge was all it was needed to actually get the conversion, whereas most of the people I see in this room have a pear-shaped body with central adiposity, right? So you know that this is not quite such a simple exercise. But so I'm saying preventive care is very important. I'm not saying it's not important. But what about first-level curative care? I was in a conversation with one of the state governments. I will not name them here, but one of the state governments who had launched an insurance scheme a few years ago. When they started, hemodialysis was 4% of the claims ratio. 2 years ago, that number was 85%. They have one of the highest levels in the world of chronic kidney disease, right? They have no plan to deal with that, right? There's no way you can deal with hospitalization, and have hospital-centric ideas to manage hypertension in the population. Which are the states that are dominant in hypertension? All of our rich states. Himachal, Punjab, Tamil Nadu, Kerala. Right? Kerala and Punjab are out of this world. Why? Kerala is spending actually more money than many other rich countries are on healthcare, right? Because primary care is entirely missing in that conversation. what we have to do, and this is where technology can make an enormous difference, is 98% of conditions have to be dealt with completely. Not simply, I will refer you to a doctor, or I'll put a telemedicine call. No, I have to address it at first point of contact, right? And you know this better than I do. The reality is, I was somewhat involved in primary care, serving about 2 lakh people in Tamil Nadu, right? We could deal with 60% of conditions. This was over a decade ago. None of the modern tech that you see today was available then, right? Unfortunately, the reality, while this is the dream, the reality is, if I ask people, do you have somewhere written down a set of protocols you can use for primary care, right? I haven't seen one. In fact, I go to cardiac hospitals, I don't see cardiac protocols. I go to cancer hospitals, I don't see cancer protocols, right? So it's not even as if they're not doing somebody else's protocol. I tell them, well, what about osteoporosis, right? We know postmenopausal women are at high risk of osteoporosis, right? They can take, a simple medicine, which is 2 rupees a day per night, if they have high risk, and they'll get 50% increase in bone density, right? It doesn't need any detailed conversation. International Osteoporosis Society has put out a tool which asks you a simple set of questions around your uncle, your auntie, your sister, and how much fractures they've had, and makes an assessment of what is your risk, and starts the medicine. It's not there, right? If I were to challenge you and say, just like the previous doctor did, show me a tool that gives me, US Preventive Services Task Force has 112 protocols for primary care, right? Is there a tool that if I'm a doctor and I want to use that tool to serve my patient better? There isn't one. I've seen apps doing all kinds of things, but not the basic integration, right? The reality, though, is there are about 150 primary care protocols for screening. There are about 500 protocols for treatment. If you add them all up together, it represents about 30,000 pathways. No doctor can humanly manage it. In fact, the unfortunate reality is, if I look at UK GP prescribing records, they're under-referring cancer by 70%. Because the trained doctor is no longer your friend, right? Because statistics, technology actually has to bolster what you're doing. Cancer is not something you can pick up by watching the patient walk into the room, right? That's just a mythology that is no longer consistent with what you can actually do on the ground, right? It is possible to do. Tech is actually essential to enable it. I really like the doctor's conversation about, can I get a truly contactless blood test? My fear, though, a little bit, is that we could end up in an environment where you're overreacting to noise and not to signal, right? Do I really need to measure my blood pressure every minute? No, not really. And I'm going to get confused about what's going on. In fact, our favorite test, the treadmill test, right, which we go for executive health checkup every year, right? Massive type 1 error, massive type 2 error. If you have unstable angina, it could trigger a heart attack, right? So under no circumstance should you be given a TMT. Yet it is a standard part of every hospital's. In fact, I'm surprised at insurers. Why are they offering it? Because they're paying for it, right? Why are they paying for it, right? Not at all clear. The hospital I can understand. If you get a slight indication of a positive, false or not, stents, angioscopies, all, there are lovely pathways that open up for a hospital, right? But yet even the very hospital, right? How many hospitals? I'm 55, right? I should be getting recommendations from the hospital to do a colonoscopy. In fact, money-making hospitals should be sending me a letter every 6 months. I have never got a letter, right? Because it needs data. It needs one piece of data about me. It needs my date of birth. Most hospital records don't even have that, right? They don't even know when I was born. If you don't know when I was born, you don't know I'm 55, so you can't send me a letter. I shared this data with somebody once, and they said, well, patients will not come. Interestingly, there is a study on this. In the population, if 15% of patients will do their own screening, one letter from a hospital, that number jumps to 50%. One call from a nurse, 70%, right? And of course, this is in an environment where doctor doesn't have God status. In India, the doctor has God status, right? Doctor said so, I will do it, right? So clearly there is a lot of opportunity for us to take our current environment. There is enough money, The very poor still exist, but the government is doing what it can to deal with them. Right? Another interesting reality, you will hear people say we don't have enough doctors, or that there are legal barriers. Actually, that's not really true. It's not really true. There was this issue of using Indian systems of medicine doctors. 1998, Mukhtiar Chand versus State of Punjab. Look at the Supreme Court judgment. Right? It's a clear judgment. 8 states have formally allowed. If at all you want to test what I'm saying, go to Bombay. Right? In Bombay, Ayurvedic doctors are legally practicing allopathic medicine. In fact, if you have the time, read the law. The law was written in 1956. Penicillin became mass use 1941. Ayurveda, by that time, had been in use for 3,000 years. Which was the more mature system of medicine in the mind of a newly independent country? Ayurveda. The law says, Ayurveds may practice Ayurveda and allopathy. The allopath dare not touch Ayurveda. It's too complicated for them. They would not understand it. Now, of course, we know the reality has changed quite a bit because they didn't understand genetics, they didn't understand many things, including the work of the dull Mr. Mendel. Ayurveda has completely escaped. Right? But the reality is, the law is much more supportive than we imagine. Right? Primary care workers on the ground now have the ability to administer amoxicillin. Right? Legal ability to administer amoxicillin as a part of a scheme. Right? So I'm not going to get into details on this, but the law is not the challenge. Our approach to this, Thailand had fewer doctors and fewer nurses than we did when we started. They started exactly where we started, roughly around the time when we started, with ASHA workers. Today, the ASHA worker of 2000 is an oncology nurse because they built a full program for her. Our ASHA of 2000 is still an ASHA of 2025. Right? No change at all. Right? They have built a health system that's the envy of the world. We have built a health system that envies the rest of the world. Right? Clearly a big difference. One of the classes I'm taking studies the Alaskan health system. Alaska, if you want remoteness, go to Alaska. Thousands of miles between villages and no roads. Only way you can access is by air. Right? What have they done? They have taken local girls, high school diploma holders, and through intensive training and engagement have made them comprehensive primary care doctors, relying on internet, relying on communication to make sure that they are staying within the straight and narrow. They have one of the best comprehensive healthcare services that we know. All this is feasible for us in India. I'm very happy to sit with anybody that tells me legal is a challenge, this is a challenge. I actually went to Supreme Court on this question. Right? It is a barrier. I'm not saying that you can do anything you want, but it is far less a barrier than people imagine it to be. Right? So my overall kind of thought with which I'm operating, which leaves me much more optimistic than many other conversations I heard today. We have enough people. We have enough training opportunity. We have some of the best tech capability in the world. Right? I was working with a South Sudanese team on developing their health system plan. I said, I'm so upset. Uttar Pradesh has a maternal mortality rate of 300. They said, sir, that is our 2050 target. Our current maternal mortality rate is 12,000. Right? We are not there. We are just not there. We have the ability to make this number. You know what a good aspirational maternal mortality rate is? 1. Right? That is the number that you aspire to. And that is the number many countries deliver today. Even Kerala is stuck at 50. And it's been stuck at 50 for the last 20 years. Right? Despite having 40% C-section rates. So it's not an availability challenge. Right? All I'm saying is we know what to do. We have some of the best brains right here in this room. Some of the conversations I heard are just outstanding conversations. People have enough money. You're not dealing with people who are looking for bits here and there. Right? We have to put our minds together to say that how do we make this magic actually happen? And I've been in Bangalore only a few months. I must say, I'm meeting some exciting people. The work they're doing, the way they are thinking about the problem. Every time I leave a meeting, I call home and I say, my God, I've arrived in heaven. This is exactly the kind of place. And I'm so pleased that NASSCOM is taking the effort to bring all the innovators together, we can do this. We don't have to wait for 50 years. Next 5 to 10 years, we can show, and we don't have to wait for the government. Government is doing what it can. If we can help them, why not, right? But they have clearly indicated they have no more money, right? In fact, the richer states have reduced. Kerala is at 0.9%. UP is at 1.3%, right? You cannot look to them for guidance. They can help you, right? The problem and solution is with us right here. Thank you very much.